Hello and welcome to the Bucket Lister podcast. Join your host Keith Crockford along with special guests who have travelled the world, here to share stories of their adventures and plenty of inspo to add to your bucket list. Now, let's get into today's episode.
Hello everyone and welcome to this episode of the Bucket Lister podcast. Today I am back chatting with Jake Field. Hello Jake.
Hi, Keith.
And today we are going to be talking about packing for Toubkal. Now, we have already done, or I did a podcast on Mount Toubkal with Grace, looking at it from a customer's perspective. So you can head back down the episode list and find that one. And that was really looking at it more from how Grace found the trek and what was involved in the trek. And what we want to concentrate a little bit more on today is actually packing for Toubkal. So, Jake, you've done Toubkal a handful of times. I've done it a couple of handful of times. So I think we're well versed in packing for Mount Toubkal, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I think so. It's something that I've done a couple of times now. So you sort of make the mistakes on the first one, and then you kind of figure it out from there. But that's what we're going to try and avoid on this podcast. This is your quick way of not making those mistakes, because you can learn from us.
And we have prepared a full packing video as well, which is over on YouTube, and I'll put a link into the show notes for this. So if you want to actually see what we're talking about, you can head over to there, have a look at the video as well, and then sort of compare everything that we're talking about. Now, I suppose the key thing with this, Jake, is, and I suppose we'll go through both options on this podcast. But when we say Toubkal, for us, that's a 4-day trek. For some people, it could be a 2-day trek, and for others, it could be a 6-day trek, couldn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. So it kind of depends on which trip you're doing. So obviously, with our summer Mount Toubkal, we offer a 4-day trek. And that's not including, obviously, the time in Marrakesh, but actually trekking on the mountains. You're going to be going first couple of days up and over some nearby passes, and then you'll head up and over to Imlil and then on to the refuge. So that's kind of our 4-day trip up Mount Toubkal and back down again. And then on our winter trip, you're going to be heading up and you'll do a little bit more around the mountains by Toubkal. You're not going to be trekking as long distance around the other valleys. It is going to be going straight up to the refuge and acclimatizing around there. So there's a little bit of a difference in terms of what kit you're going to need. I always think with the summer kit, or with the summer Mount Toubkal, you always need a little less than you think you do. It's important to have a warm layer. It does get cold when you leave early in the morning, so definitely don't think that it's going to be scorching the whole time. And it's always important to have your waterproofs. But you're not necessarily going to need a fresh pair of trousers for every day and things like that. Whereas the winter Mount Toubkal, that's where you're going to have a few extra pieces of kit. Winter kit specifically, it does get cold. You can get a lot of snow up there, so that's something that you want to be nice and prepared for.
Yeah, so I think if we, like you say, I think most people, if you do. Obviously, if you could have clicked onto this podcast and you've got no clue where Mount Toubkal is. So let's just start off with that point first. So Mount Toubkal is the highest mountain in North Africa and also the Arab world. It sits in the Atlas Mountains and it stands at 4,167 meters in altitude. So it's a great peak if, a lot of people want to smash out their first 4,000 meter peak. That's kind of like, if you're talking about high altitude trekking, then that's kind of the first benchmark really that you want to get on top of a 4,000 meter peak. So that's why Toubkal.
People, it's kind of where I say you want to start. If you're getting into your mountaineering, if you want to start pushing the altitude and you're not sure the best way to go about it, then Mount Toubkal, I always think, is a really good starting point. It's where I began. It gives you time to really get familiar with being at altitude, make sure you've got all of the right kit before you start committing to those bigger trips like Everest Base Camp, Kilimanjaro. And some people even use it as training when they've booked Kilimanjaro or Everest Base Camp. They'll then sign on to a smaller trip the year before, and just make sure that that's kind of part of their training process.
Yeah, definitely. So obviously 9 times out of 10, you will fly into Marrakesh airport. You might have a couple of days in Marrakesh first, and then you'll head out on the normally about an hour and a half to 2 hour drive, depending on where your start point would be for Mount Toubkal. Obviously, on all of our trips, we tend to be able to leave stuff in Marrakesh because we will be returning back to the same point again. So when you're packing, you don't necessarily always need to take everything with you. Although on recent trips, we have taken our bags with us, because when we do get to Imlil, we then come back to Imlil for the night again. So we can leave our stuff in Imlil. So you don't have to take it on the trek, but the company we use drop all of your bags at the guest house in Imlil. So when you get back off the trek again, you've got all your clean stuff ready to go. So that works really nicely. So the options you have, you might be doing a 2-day Mount Toubkal, which will be you go to Imlil. From Imlil, you go to the refuge, stay at the refuge for the night. The following morning, you summit Toubkal and then come all the way back down to Imlil again. Now, so realistically, on that trip, you are not going to need very much stuff with you in your bag. You will need, I mean, if we talk about the 2-day trek first, Jake, I mean, obviously, you are going to need the basics like you're always going to need, depending on whether or not your stuff is being carried in a mule or whether or not you are carrying all your kit up with you. But on a 2-day trek, you could probably get away with carrying it yourself, although because you need to have a guide for Toubkal, quite often you will have a mule there that will take your stuff with you, so you only need to carry a day pack with you. But like Jake said earlier, I've gone right up to the refuge in sort of any time from April through till middle of October. You can generally get to the refuge in a pair of shorts. It can be really warm. You probably want to be avoiding the main summer period anyway. So July, August, it will be scorching hot up there then at that point. But even in the shoulder seasons of the summer, it's still plenty warm enough that a t-shirt, a technical t-shirt and a pair of shorts is perfectly adequate. Spare pair of trousers in your bag. And pretty much if you're on the 2-day trek, that would be enough in reality, wouldn't it? Like,
yeah, 100%. You don't need to carry loads. I always find that people end up overpacking, and then they're just carrying the weight for no reason. Even if you're not carrying it yourself and you think, oh, well, I'll just stick it in and, it's going to go up on a donkey. Well, the thing is, it's just adding space into your bag, and then you have to rummage through all of that when you're trying to find things. It's far better to carry less. Ultimately, you are a pair of trousers and a pair of shorts is going to see you all the way right through, and in terms of those, and then a couple of t-shirts, a mid layer, and a jacket. Because ultimately, in the first day or two, you're going to be in a t-shirt. It might get a little chilly, so you might occasionally throw on that mid layer, but that's not something that you're going to need a second one of. And then you're only going to need one jacket for if it gets really cold and cool in the evenings, or for when you start nice and early in the morning climbing up Toubkal. But as soon as that sun rises, it becomes a really lovely warm day as well. So I would almost say 2 proper outfit changes, and then maybe an extra t-shirt. If you've got technical t-shirts, then you don't need to worry as much about them smelling if you're sweating through them. If you're wearing the thick cotton ones, then that's going to become quite unpleasant. But any sort of technical tee or gym t-shirt is going to be fine.
And then what would you say regarding trainers or boots?
Well, I always recommend boots to people. I think that even though it does get warm, if you can find a pair of boots that's got the ankle support, it just means that you're going to eliminate any risk of twisting an ankle. Having said that, I've gone out and done this trek multiple times, and I'm also, I would say, a little bit more steady on my feet through going out on these trips multiple times a year, that sometimes I will wear not trainers, they're called approach shoes. They give me a good amount of grip, and I do walk in those. But the perfect balance that I find is if you're worried about boots being too hot, and you're worried about trainers not giving you enough support, you can go for a mid-range option, which is sort of a high-ankled approach shoe that I know a lot of our guides have started wearing. And that can be, especially for the warmer trips, that can be a great kind of intermediate. But yeah, I tend to always recommend boots for people. And it does get chilly on the evening, so even if I was wearing trainers up for the first couple of days, I'd definitely be changing into boots for the summit.
Yeah, I think, the summit has a lot of scree. And I think more often than not, if you're going to go over, it's going to be on the way back down again from the summit. And actually having something there to protect your ankle, I think on this trek, I probably wouldn't go for an approach shoe. I would probably go for a mid-ankle. I wouldn't go so much for a full. Obviously, on the winter trek, you're going to be needing to wear crampons, so then you would go for a high boot.
I think if I'm taking approach shoes and I end up wearing them for the first 2 days, I've always got a pair of boots in my bag. So I always take boots as the short answer, and sometimes I would take a pair of trainers to change into. Also, but yeah, you're right. Like you can still get snow up there at crazy times of year, in which case you will need to fit crampons, and you can't do that in trainers or approach shoes. So boots is really either mid-sized or full ankle support is really the only way that you want to go.
Yeah, and I mean, like they do, if you're in Imlil or you're up at the refuge, if you don't need to take crampons with you unless you're specifically going out there for a winter climb. But if you find that actually there is a bit of snow out there, then they can be hired and they will just fit onto, they're a sort of a strap-on version of the crampon. So they will go on to normal, to any style boot, really. So even if you've got a mid-ankle boot, they will still strap onto those fine. They are proper crampons. They're more than the spikes that you get. But they're not the fixed ones that you would get on a B2 boot with a C2 crampon. So you have got the option to hire those. So don't worry about going and buying a crampon specific boot to go out and do Mount Toubkal unless you are going out and doing the winter climb.
Yeah, absolutely. Like you don't need to go out and spend loads of money. I think if you are going out and doing the winter, it's because you're looking at getting a taste of winter mountaineering and potentially going on and doing bigger winter trips like Island Peak, Mirror Peak, in which case the investment is going to be worth it. But yeah, definitely for the summer trip, even if you do end up with a bit of snow out there, the crampons will fit over pretty much every summer boot that you're going to own.
Yeah. So obviously, sleeping bag you're going to need. If you are just heading up for the refuge and you're doing the 2-day one, the refuge can be really warm. So even though you're at altitude, you're going to be at about 3,200 meters. It can be cold up at the refuge, but because the way the refuge is, it has large dormitory style rooms with an alpine bed set up. It does get very warm in there. So don't think, I need to take my 4-season sleeping bag, because you will end up too hot and not being able to sleep at that point, won't you?
Oh, yeah, massively. That was a mistake that I made, was I ended up taking, my big 4-season down sleeping bag. And especially when you get to, the Berber houses lower down are lovely and warm, but definitely on the, once you're in the refuge, there's just so many people because it is communal living. So quite often when we've got a big group, we'll all be in one big room together. Sometimes you get people from other groups, but yeah, it definitely heats up the room. So now I just take a summer sleeping bag and a liner. Sometimes the liner, is enough as it is.
Yeah, and then for normally we get up around 4-5 o'clock to go for the summit on Toubkal, depending on what the weather's doing. So other things that you will need to have with you would be sunglasses for later on once the sun comes up. I'd also advise you to have a warm beanie hat. Also two pairs of gloves, really. You kind of want a thin pair and a thicker pair of gloves. Yeah. Obviously, then you can start off with the thick ones, and as it starts to warm up a little bit, you can kind of layer them up to suit your needs. But that's kind of what you would need from a warmth perspective. Obviously, Jake said earlier, again, you are going to want to take your waterproofs with you, and you might end up, if it's windy, it might not be raining, but you might actually put them on summit morning just to act as a bit of a windbreaker to keep the wind off you. I mean, I did a late March trip a few years ago, and we didn't actually reach the summit because the conditions were that bad, and we had a full-on whiteout, which was kind of quite late in the season, really. We were kind of expecting it to be much better than it was. But that was proper cold. Like, you certainly did need to have your waterproofs. You did need to have your thermals. You know, it was like your hood was freezing to your head because it was, you know, you sort of like, you had to like break the ice off your waterproof off the hood because it had literally gone solid. Trekking pole as well, depending on what your preference is with trekking poles, I would kind of take either one or two trekking poles, again, especially for coming back down. As I said earlier, it is a very, very steep descent on the way back down. You kind of, a bit like Kilimanjaro, you sort of zigzag up it, but you can kind of come a bit more direct on the way down, which adds to the steepness a little bit. And it is quite screedy. So actually having a trekking pole or two trekking poles just to kind of help with your balance on the way down, and to help your knees a little bit as well, really does help.
I think they're really, really useful to take. I think for a lot of people, it's just offering you that support and balance, especially when you come back down. I noticed that most people are a little bit unsteadier when they're coming down the scree slope on Toubkal. You're tired. It's been an early morning. You've got a long day ahead. And actually just having that extra little bit of support is really useful. I do think once you know how to use them, they're far better. But if you're unsure and you don't know how to use them, then give them a go. Always take them, give them a go. But otherwise, if you
always have a practice with them on the way up when you're.
It's a little bit like weighting your boots in. Just make sure that you're practicing.
Yeah, you've got used to. Yeah, the number of people who unpack their trekking poles because they bought a set and never actually used them before a trip, you know, and then they're just like, how do these work? What height do they need to be at? Like, just have a little bit of a play and see what's comfortable for you. But normally, if you're kind of walking on the flat, you generally want your arm to be at right angles to the pole, is kind of, you know, where it is a perfect height for you really. You know, and then, you know, when you're going uphill, you generally want them a bit shorter. And then when you're going downhill, you kind of just want them that little bit longer. But just have a little bit of a play around with it and see what's comfortable really. What's your thoughts on rucksack, day sacks, day packs for this trip, Jake?
Yeah, so for me, I think you need to find something that is going to be around. I would say I always like going for the 40 to 50 is probably going to be pretty good. The reason I kind of about it is because I think if you take a big trekking backpack, so you're taking like a huge bag, then you are just going to be inclined to fill it. But also if you take a bag that's too small, you're going to have to really tightly pack it with everything, and it's a pain when you want to get something out because you're going to have to rummage around. So going for something intermediate where you don't necessarily fill it, but you've got what I call rummage room. You've got the ability to put things in loosely. You can get your hand in there and find stuff easily. You don't have to take everything out to get to that one piece of kit. I also really like, and it's probably getting a little bit too technical, but I always keep an eye out for backpacks that have a side zip that I can get into the bag, into the side. It doesn't always have to be a top loading rucksack, but something that's comfortable, something that maybe has a ventilation thing on the back so you don't end up getting too sweaty with it pressed up nice and tight against your back. Ultimately, the best thing to do is head to a shop like Cotswolds and go and try one on. You want to make sure that it's comfortable on your hips and on your shoulders, and that's going to be the best thing to do really. So whatever you've got, make sure it's got enough space and it's nice and comfortable.
Yeah, I think, you know, I kind of agree with you on that. I mean, I think generally I wear a 35 to 45 litre day pack when I'm on a trek. And my main reason for that is because generally you're going to start off with it more so on summit night, in that you're going to start off with it being empty. And then once you start like taking your layers off, then that needs to go somewhere. So you might have your water in there, you might have your first aid kit in there, you might have your camera in there. So that's all right. But then once you get to the top and you start your way down and the sun's out and it's beating down, you're certainly not going to want to be wearing your down jacket and your waterproofs, and they've got to go somewhere. And I think, I see so many people who start off with like a 20-litre rucksack, and then on the way down, they've got bits hanging off the sides and like,
I would say probably around the 35 to 45 is going to be ideal. Having said that, you don't need to go any bigger than that, especially for a trip like this. And you're right. I've had people going with really ridiculously small bags and everything's hanging off it, and it does just look like when you see the DOV kids coming through with pops and hanging off the side of their bag. Yeah,
they got their roll mat and their sleeping bag on the top, and it was something like the famous 5 from 1974.
That's it.
But other things that you're potentially you are going to need is you're going to need a head torch, because like you say, we're going to start off at 5 o'clock in the morning. It is going to be pitch black outside.
Definitely need spare batteries or a spare head torch. The amount of people that I find that bring a head torch and they go to turn it on when we leave at 4 o'clock in the morning and they realise the battery's dead. It happens more often than not. So definitely bring a spare head torch or spare batteries.
Yeah. Or, depending on, some now have a USB charging and you can literally charge them up from your battery pack if you've got a battery pack with you to charge your phone or whatever. So just having a way of making sure, because you are going to use your head torch. I mean, like around the refuge, or if you're on one of our trips where you're at the guest house or you're at the Berber house for 2 days before you even get there, you're going to be using your head torch to get around in the evenings and stuff. So make sure you've got a full charge when you leave in the morning, because some of them now are so super bright that they just burn through the batteries really quickly. So I think that's pretty much covers off our normal Toubkal trek in terms of, most of that stuff. If you're already into hiking, trekking, you've got lying around anyway. So there are really no real special stuff that you need to go out and buy if you just want to head out and do the standard Toubkal trek. Obviously, if you are looking and thinking about the winter trek, like, you've done a lot of hiking in the UK, maybe you've already been and done some stuff in the Alps or whatever, and, Tour de Mont Blanc or something like that. And then you want to go and give Toubkal a go in the winter, then you are going to need a little bit more kit on top of that, in terms of you will need a climbing helmet, you will need a walking axe, you will need boots with crampons. So you're going to need at least a B2 boot with a C2 crampon fitted to it. So you don't need too much. We're not going into the realms of harnesses and rope work and that sort of thing, but you just need to be able to. And if you've never walked in crampons before, or you've never walked with a walking axe before, then that's not a problem, because we will go through that with you. Before we start the trek, we will do a training session when we get up to the refuge before we go to the summit. So don't think, I've never done that before, so I can't do the trip. You definitely can do the trip, and we will go through those things with you at that point. So again, not a great deal of extra stuff. There are companies out there that hire it. You can hire walking axes from the Bucket List Company. We've got crampons at the Bucket List Company. We've got helmets at the Bucket List Company. So again, if you're not sure that you're going to do more and more of these, then you can hire it from us, and it will be delivered to you before the trip, and we can go from there. So you do have those options as well. Jake, have we missed anything on the packing for Toubkal?
The only thing that I would add to that, to make sure everyone has, and you don't necessarily realise when you're out there, is just how intense the sun is. So I would always make sure you've got sun cream. Even when you get higher up, especially if you do end up with a little bit of snow, I think people are often quite surprised at how strong the sun can be being reflected up off the snow. And you definitely don't want to get sunburnt on day one, and that's pretty miserable for the rest of the trip.
Yeah,
So
yeah. And I think as well, I think that's important as well when it comes to sunglasses, because we're not on a fashion show, I think is the way to say it. Like,
we're definitely not on a fashion show.
No. Well, I mean, you know what they say, Jake. The first rule of being a guide is look cool. It's that's
true.
That's very true. But in terms of making sure that the sunglasses wrap round properly, they're not letting light in from the sides, because I get it all the time where you finish the day and you have a headache, and it's because the intensity of the sun coming through, if you're not blocking that out. So make sure you get a good pair of polarized sunglasses that are wrap around. What would you do water bottle wise?
Well, I really like the water to go bottles. I can still fill them up with the amount of litres that I'm going to need for that day. But I know that I've always got the option of, if it is a really hot day and I end up drinking more, then I can fill up on rivers and streams and things like that. The nice thing about the Mount Toubkal trek is it's reasonably well facilitated. So there'll be moments, when we go up and over the pass on our 4-day trip, there's a guy at the top selling orange juice, which is brilliant. When you go on the way to Imlil, there's a lovely river, and you'll stop down there and you can have tea by the river and things like that. So it's not something that you need to start carrying 16 litres of water and prepping to be out there for days on end without it. But I always like the flexibility that those bottles give me. I think whether you like using Camelbacks or whether you like using water bottles, as long as you got enough to have a couple of litres on you throughout the day, that's going to be fine.
Yeah, and Imlil is a pretty well stocked place. You can buy everything you need in Imlil. So and you can get bottled water out there. Obviously, we're trying to reduce the single-use plastic. So we would rather you take a water to go bottle or take purification tablets and just fill up as in where. But there are the options of bottled water, but again, it gets more expensive up at the refuge in places like that. So just have a think about that, really. Well, I think we've pretty much, Jake, covered off packing for Mount Toubkal, whether you're doing the 2-day route where you just need to pack a pair of pants and a pair of trousers and that's you ready to go, or if you're doing the slightly longer 4-day route where you're going to need a little bit more stuff, and then also again the winter route as well, where you're going to need a bit more specialist equipment in that one. But like I say, we don't offer the 2-day route. We only offer it as the 4-day route. And that's mainly from an acclimatization perspective. We think the 2-day route is quite rushed. So we do prefer the 4-day route. And I think it gives a much better experience and a much better acclimatization profile as well. So do your research. Think which one's right for you. But if you've got any questions on Mount Toubkal and you think that could be something that could be on your bucket list, then please do get in contact. I'll put a link to all of those trips in the show notes for you to have a look through as well and see if one of our trips is potentially for you. Jake, thanks very much for coming on and sharing your expertise on Mount Toubkal with me.
Thank you very much for having me back on season 2.
Season 2, yeah. We're a few episodes into season 2 now. Like I said, we've got plenty of other episodes, and we've already got one which really does talks through Mount Toubkal from a customer's perspective, when we had Grace join us on the trip, and that goes back to episode 15. So quite a while ago that we had that one when Grace was on that one on episode 15, bearing in mind we are now recording episode 57, I think. So it was a while ago we did that one. But again, I'll put a link back into the show notes so you can quickly find that episode if you want to go and hear about it from a customer's perspective as well. And Grace did a really nice video as well. That's up on YouTube of her trip. So you can sort of see what the 4-day trek looks like on that video. So again, I will put a link to that in the show notes. Thank you ever so much, everyone, for listening. Hope you found this episode interesting. and provided you with some knowledge as well. And I mean, I think quite a lot of that stuff you can take into other treks as well. It's not just Mount Toubkal, you can take that too, but we've kind of made it a bit specific for Mount Toubkal today. So Jake, thanks again. Thank you all for listening, and I'll be back next week with another episode of the Bucket Lister podcast. Goodbye.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Bucket Lister podcast. Be sure to click follow to be alerted for next week's episode. For more travel inspiration, check us out at www.thebucketlistcompany.co.uk or follow us on socials. See you next time.